I never thought a simple family barbecue would nearly destroy my life. But when Karen Henderson knocked on my door at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning with a cease and desist letter, I realized I was about to fight the battle of my lifetime. My name is David, and for the past 12 years, I've called Willowbrook Estates home. It's one of those planned communities where every lawn is perfectly manicured, every mailbox painted the exact same shade of forest green, and every resident is expected to follow the rules without question. I thought I knew those rules inside and out. I was wrong. The letter in Karen's manicured hands that morning would spark a war that would divide our entire neighborhood, expose decades-old secrets buried in HOA documents, and ultimately lead to the most satisfying revenge I've ever witnessed. But before I tell you how I turned our community pool into the biggest block party our HOA had ever seen, you need to understand how deep this rabbit hole really goes. Because what started as a dispute over my annual 4th of July barbecue would uncover a conspiracy that had been robbing our neighbors blind for over a decade. And Karen Henderson, our self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, was about to learn that some battles aren't worth picking. Let me take you back to where this all began. Willowbrook Estates sits on what used to be farmland about 30 miles outside the city. When my wife Sarah and I moved here in 2012, we fell in love with the tree-lined streets, the community pool, and the promise of a quiet suburban life where our kids could ride their bikes safely and neighbors actually knew each other's names. The HOA seemed reasonable enough at first. Monthly dues of $200 covered landscaping, snow removal, and maintenance of common areas. The rules were straightforward. No loud music after 10 p.m. Keep your grass cut, and get approval before making major changes to your property's exterior. Simple enough. For 11 years, Sarah and I hosted our annual 4th of July barbecue. It had become a neighborhood tradition. We'd set up tables in our backyard, fire up the grill, and invite everyone within a 3-block radius. Kids would run through sprinklers while adults shared stories over cold beer and homemade potato salad. It was exactly the kind of community spirit you'd expect in a place like Willowbrook. But last year, everything changed. Karen Henderson moved into the house directly across from ours in March. Within a week, she'd introduced herself to every neighbor on our street, armed with a clipboard and what she called her Community Improvement Initiative. Karen was in her mid-50s, recently divorced, and had apparently decided that Willowbrook Estates would become her personal project. The first sign of trouble came in April when Karen started attending HOA board meetings. Now, most residents in our community couldn't even tell you when these meetings happened, let alone actually show up. But Karen didn't just attend, she arrived with typed notes, printed copies of HOA bylaws, and a list of violations she documented during her daily walks around the neighborhood. Sarah noticed the change immediately. She's been taking pictures of our fence, she told me one evening as we watched Karen march past our house for the 3rd time that day. Our fence was the same height it had been for 12 years. Well within HOA guidelines, but something about Karen's intense scrutiny made us both uneasy. By June, the complaints started rolling in. First, it was our garbage cans apparently. We were putting them out 15 minutes too early on Thursday mornings. Then it was our garden hose, which Karen claimed was creating an unsightly appearance when left coiled near our front steps. Each complaint came with a formal letter from the HOA board threatening fines if the issues weren't corrected within 10 days. I tried to give Karen the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just trying to protect property values. Maybe she genuinely cared about the community's appearance. But when she started timing our sprinkler system and measuring the height of our mailbox with a ruler, I realized we were dealing with something else entirely. The breaking point came on July 2, just 2 days before our annual barbecue. I was in the garage organizing coolers and checking our grill supplies when I heard shouting from the front yard. Through the window, I could see Karen standing at the edge of our property, clipboard in hand, having what appeared to be a heated discussion with our neighbor Tom. Tom Martinez had lived in Willowbrook for 15 years and was one of the most easygoing people you'd ever meet. He coached Little League, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and had never caused a moment of trouble for anyone. But there he was, red-faced and clearly frustrated, gesturing toward his perfectly maintained lawn while Karen scribbled notes furiously. I walked outside to see what was happening. "Everything okay out here?" I asked, though I could already sense the tension in the air. Tom turned to me with a look of complete disbelief. "She's measuring my grass," he said. "She says it's 3/4 of an inch too long and that she's reporting me to the board." Karen looked up from her clipboard with a satisfied smile. "The HOA bylaws clearly state that grass height cannot exceed 2.5 inches during growing season," she said in that patronizing tone I was beginning to know all too well. "Mr. Martinez's lawn is currently measuring 3 1/4 inches." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process what I was hearing. In all my years in Willowbrook, no one had ever measured grass height. The general rule was simply to keep your lawn neat and tidy, which Tom certainly did. "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "don't you think measuring grass with a ruler is a bit excessive?" Her expression hardened. "Rules are rules, David. If we start making exceptions, where does it end?" That night, Sarah and I talked about canceling the barbecue. The thought of Karen lurking around with her clipboard, looking for violations and making our guests uncomfortable, was enough to make us seriously consider calling the whole thing off. But our kids had been looking forward to it for months, and half the neighborhood had already RSVP'd. "We're not letting her ruin our tradition," Sarah said firmly. "We've been doing this for 11 years without any problems. One difficult neighbor isn't going to change that." I wanted to believe she was right, but something in my gut told me Karen Henderson wasn't done with us yet. The morning of July 4th started like any other holiday in our house. Sarah was up early, preparing her famous potato salad, while I hauled tables and chairs from the garage to our backyard. Our kids, Emma and Jake, were already in their red, white, and blue outfits, bouncing with excitement about the day ahead. By noon, neighbors started arriving with covered dishes and coolers full of drinks. The Johnsons brought their homemade coleslaw. The Patel family contributed delicious samosas that had become a barbecue staple, and old Mr. Chen from down the street arrived with enough sparklers to light up the entire block. It was shaping up to be one of our best gatherings yet. That's when Karen appeared at our back gate. She wasn't carrying food or drinks like every other neighbor. Instead, she had her ever-present clipboard, a camera, and what appeared to be some kind of sound meter device. She walked through our yard like she was conducting an inspection, taking photos of our decorations, measuring the distance between our tables and the property line, and holding up her meter whenever someone laughed too loudly. "What is she doing?" whispered Mrs. Johnson, nodding toward Karen, who is now photographing our grill setup from multiple angles. I walked over to where Karen was crouched down, apparently measuring the height of our party tent with a retractable measuring tape. "Karen, what's going on?" I asked. "Are you enjoying the barbecue?" She stood up and fixed me with a look I'll never forget. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder, like she was looking at a problem that needed to be solved. "I'm documenting violations," she said matter-of-factly. "Your tent requires a permit for structures over 8 feet in height. Your music exceeds the acceptable decibel level for residential areas. And you have 17 cars parked on the street, which violates the guest parking restrictions." I felt my stomach drop. In 11 years of hosting this barbecue, no one had ever mentioned permits or decibel levels or parking restrictions. "Karen, this is a neighborhood gathering. Everyone here lives within a few blocks. Rules don't change just because it's a holiday, David." The rest of the barbecue continued, but Karen's presence had cast a shadow over everything. Neighbors kept glancing nervously in her direction. Conversations became more subdued, and several families left earlier than usual. By the time we were cleaning up that evening, I knew our tradition would never be the same. The first letter arrived 3 days later. It was on official HOA letterhead, signed by Board President Margaret Walsh, and it was devastating. According to the letter, our July 4th barbecue had violated no fewer than 8 HOA regulations. We were being fined $200 for operating without proper permits, $150 for exceeding noise ordinances, $100 for guest parking violations, and another $300 for what they called commercial-grade food preparation on residential property. $750 in fines for a neighborhood barbecue that had been happening without incident for over a decade. I called Margaret Walsh immediately, but her response was disappointing. "I'm sorry, David, but the violations were documented with photographic evidence and decibel readings. The board has no choice but to enforce the rules as written." "But Margaret, you've been to our barbecue. You know this isn't some commercial operation. It's just neighbors getting together. The HOA has to be consistent in enforcement," she said, though I could hear the regret in her voice. "If we make exceptions for one event, we'll have to make exceptions for all of them." That night, Sarah and I sat at our kitchen table, staring at the letter. $750 was a significant hit to our family budget, but it wasn't really about the money. It was about the principle. It was about a community tradition being destroyed by someone who seemed to take pleasure in finding fault with everything around her. "We have to fight this," Sarah said. "This isn't right." I wanted to agree with her, but I also knew how these things typically went. HOAs had broad authority to interpret their own rules, and board members rarely overturned decisions once they'd been made official. Still, something about the whole situation felt wrong. Over the next week, I started reaching out to other neighbors who had been at the barbecue. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The Martinezes had received a $400 fine for unauthorized lawn modifications after Karen reported that their flower bed was 6 inches too close to the street. The Johnsons got hit with a $250 penalty for a non-compliant mailbox that had been in place for 8 years. Even elderly Mr. Chen was fined $150 for improper holiday decorations because his 4th of July flag was allegedly displayed incorrectly. Karen Henderson wasn't just targeting my family. She was systematically going after every neighbor who had attended our barbecue. The pattern became clear when I talked to the Patel family. "She came by the next morning," Mrs. Patel told me, her voice shaking with anger. "She said she had been documenting violations in our yard and that we could expect to hear from the HOA board soon." David, she was smiling when she said it. She was enjoying this. I began to realize that we weren't dealing with someone who genuinely cared about community standards. We were dealing with someone who had weaponized the HOA rules to wage personal vendettas against her neighbors. But the situation was about to get much worse. On July 15, I received a second letter from the HOA. This one wasn't about fines or violations. It was a cease and desist order demanding that I cancel all future outdoor gatherings at my residence pending a community impact assessment. The letter went on to explain that large gatherings required special permits and insurance coverage, and until I could provide documentation proving compliance with all applicable regulations, no outdoor entertaining would be permitted on my property. They were trying to ban our barbecue permanently. I called an emergency meeting with Margaret Walsh and the other board members, but when I arrived at the community center that evening, I discovered something that made my heart sink. Karen Henderson was sitting at the table next to Margaret, with a stack of files in front of her and a nameplate that read Special Compliance Advisor. "When did Karen join the board?" I asked Margaret. "She was appointed to a special advisory position last week," Margaret replied, not quite meeting my eyes. Her documentation of community violations has been very thorough, and the board felt her attention to detail would be valuable. I looked around the table at board members I had known for years, people who had eaten at my barbecue, whose children had played in my backyard, who had always seemed reasonable and fair. But something had changed. They looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic, but none of them were willing to challenge Karen's authority. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Every question I raised was met with references to documented violations and liability concerns. Every precedent I cited was dismissed as outdated interpretation of current regulations. By the time I left that evening, it was clear that Karen Henderson had somehow managed to seize control of our HOA board, and she was using that power to systematically destroy the sense of community that had made Willowbrook Estates feel like home. But as I walked to my car that night, I noticed something odd. Karen's vehicle wasn't in the parking lot, even though I had seen her inside just minutes earlier. I looked around and spotted her sedan parked behind the building, almost hidden from view. Through the rear window, I could see boxes of documents and what appeared to be a laptop computer. Why would Karen need to hide her car? And what was she doing with all those files? Something wasn't adding up, and I was determined to find out what Karen Henderson was really up to. The next morning, I did something I had never done in 12 years of living in Willowbrook Estates. I requested copies of all HOA financial records and board meeting minutes from the past 5 years. As a homeowner, I had the legal right to review these documents, though I had never felt the need to do so before. Margaret Walsh seemed surprised by my request, but agreed to have the documents ready within a week. What I didn't expect was the phone call I received 2 days later. "David, this is Margaret. I need to talk to you about your document request." Her voice sounded strained, almost frightened. "Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow morning? Somewhere outside the neighborhood?" We met at a small cafe about 10 miles from Willowbrook. Margaret arrived, looking like she hadn't slept in days, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be watching her. "I don't know who to trust anymore," she said without preamble. "Something very wrong is happening with our HOA, and I think you might be the only person who can help stop it." What Margaret told me over the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about my community and about Karen Henderson. "It started 6 months ago," Margaret explained, "when Karen first began attending board meetings. She came prepared with detailed knowledge of HOA law and financial management, claiming she had experience running homeowner associations in her previous city. At first, the board was grateful for her expertise. She pointed out inefficiencies in our budget," Margaret said. "She showed us ways we could save money on landscaping contracts and maintenance agreements. She seemed to genuinely care about keeping our dues low and our community well maintained." But then Karen started identifying compliance issues that required expensive solutions. The community's insurance policy needed to be upgraded. The landscaping contract required additional liability coverage. The pool maintenance agreement was apparently insufficient to meet current health department standards. Every solution she proposed involved hiring companies that she recommended, Margaret continued. She always had business cards ready, quotes prepared, and detailed explanations for why these particular vendors were our best options. The board, trusting Karen's apparent expertise, began approving these contracts. The monthly HOA dues jumped from $200 to $325 per household to cover the increased costs. Residents grumbled about the increase, but Karen had prepared convincing presentations about rising insurance costs and inflation in the maintenance industry. "But here's what bothers me," Margaret said, leaning across the table. "I tried to verify some of these companies she recommended, and David, I can't find any evidence that most of them actually exist." She showed me printouts of business licenses and corporate registrations she had researched online. Atlas Insurance Solutions, the company now handling our HOA's liability coverage, had no business license in our state. Emerald Landscaping Services, which had replaced our longtime groundskeeping contractor, had a business address that led to an empty strip mall. Premier Pool Maintenance had a phone number that went to voicemail, and no one ever returned calls. "I think Karen Henderson is stealing from us," Margaret whispered. "I think she's created fake companies and is billing the HOA for services that don't exist." My mind was reeling. If Margaret was right, Karen wasn't just a difficult neighbor with an obsession for rules enforcement. She was running an elaborate fraud scheme, using her position on the HOA board to embezzle money from every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates. "Why haven't you called the police?" I asked. Margaret's expression grew even more troubled. "Because I can't prove it yet. And because I'm scared of what might happen if I'm wrong. Karen has documentation for everything. She has contracts, invoices, insurance policies, all of it looks legitimate on the surface. If I make accusations and can't back them up, she could sue me personally. She could have me removed from the board. And with her knowledge of HOA law, she might find ways to make life very difficult for anyone who challenges her. So what do we do?" "We need proof," Margaret said. "Real evidence that shows these companies are fraudulent. And we need to be very careful about how we get it, because I suspect Karen is watching everyone who might pose a threat to her operation." That afternoon, I began my investigation. Using public records, databases, and business registration websites, I started tracing every company that had received payments from our HOA since Karen's arrival. What I discovered was staggering. Of the 12 new contractors Karen had recommended, only 3 had verifiable business licenses. Of those 3, 2 had addresses that led to residential homes, and the third was registered to a post office box in a city 400 miles away. Phone numbers led to disconnected voicemails or forwarding services. Websites looked professional, but contained no real contact information beyond generic email addresses. But the most damning evidence came when I cross-referenced the bank account information from the invoices. Every single one of Karen's recommended contractors had the same routing number, indicating they all used the same bank. More specifically, they all appeared to be tied to accounts at a small community bank in Karen's previous city of residence. I was beginning to understand the scope of Karen's operation. She had created an entire network of shell companies, all designed to funnel money from HOA accounts into her personal control. The estimated theft over just 6 months totaled more than $150,000. But I still needed concrete proof. And that's when I remembered something odd from the night of the board meeting. Karen's car parked behind the building, loaded with boxes and a laptop computer. I started paying closer attention to Karen's movements around the neighborhood. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she would load boxes from her house into her car and drive to an office building about 15 minutes away. She would stay for about 2 hours, then return with the same boxes. On a Thursday evening in late July, I decided to follow her. The office building was a generic 2-story structure that housed various small businesses, insurance agents, tax preparers, and a few consulting firms. Karen parked in the back and used a key to enter through a side door. The directory in the lobby showed that she was accessing Suite 204, which was listed as Henderson Consulting Services. I waited in my car until I saw lights come on in a second-floor window. Through the glass, I could see Karen sitting at a desk with multiple computer monitors, surrounded by the boxes she had carried in from her car. For the next hour, I watched her work, occasionally taking phone calls and typing furiously on her laptop. When she finally packed up and left, I knew I had found the nerve center of her operation. The next week, I shared my findings with Margaret and 2 other longtime board members who had grown suspicious of Karen's influence. We agreed that we needed to confront Karen directly, but we also needed to be prepared for her to deny everything and possibly retaliate against anyone who challenged her. "We need to catch her in the act," said board member Robert Kim. "We need evidence that she's actively stealing from us, not just circumstantial proof that her companies might be fraudulent." That's when I came up with a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. "What if we set a trap?" I suggested. "What if we create a situation where Karen has to choose between maintaining her cover and protecting her operation?" I proposed that we announce plans for a major community improvement project, something expensive enough that Karen would be tempted to get involved, but specific enough that we could control the circumstances. We would invite contractors to submit bids, but we would also give Karen the opportunity to recommend her own preferred vendors. "If she takes the bait," I explained, "we'll have her on record recommending fraudulent contractors for a project that we're documenting from the beginning. And if she doesn't take the bait, we'll know she's becoming suspicious of our investigation." The project we invented was a community pavilion for the pool area, a $75,000 construction job that would require multiple contractors and extensive insurance coverage. We announced the project at the August board meeting and invited residents to attend a special session where various contractors would present their proposals. Karen's reaction was immediate and predictable. Within 24 hours, she had contacted Margaret with a list of pre-qualified contractors who she claimed had experience with similar projects in other communities. She provided detailed cost estimates, timeline projections, and insurance documentation for each of her recommended companies. Every single company on Karen's list was fraudulent. Every business license was fake, every insurance policy was fabricated, and every cost estimate was inflated by at least 40% compared to legitimate contractors. But now, we had her on record, in writing, recommending contractors that we could prove didn't exist. We had documentation of her fraud scheme, evidence of her theft, and a clear pattern of deception that stretched back months. The question now was what to do with this information. We could turn everything over to the police and let the criminal justice system handle Karen Henderson. Or we could give her a chance to face the consequences of her actions in front of the community she had been deceiving. I vote for option 2. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday, August 19th at 2 p.m. in the community center. Margaret had sent notices to every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates, stating only that the board would be addressing significant financial and governance issues affecting our community. Karen, of course, assumed the meeting was about approving her recommended contractors for the pavilion project. She arrived 30 minutes early with her usual collection of files, prepared to present detailed proposals and answer any questions about the construction timeline. She had no idea that half the neighborhood already knew the truth about her operation. Word had spread quickly once Margaret and I started sharing our evidence with other residents. The Martinezes, the Johnsons, the Patels, and dozens of other families who had been subjected to Karen's harassment campaign were eager to hear what we had discovered. By the time the meeting started, the community center was packed with more residents than had attended any HOA gathering in the history of Willowbrook Estates. Karen took her seat at the board table with confidence, apparently believing she was about to oversee another successful expansion of her fraudulent operation. She smiled and waved at residents as they filed in, playing the role of the concerned community advocate who had worked so hard to protect everyone's interests. Margaret called the meeting to order and began with an announcement that caught Karen completely off guard. "Before we discuss any new business today," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in the room, "the board needs to address some serious concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding financial irregularities in HOA operations." I watched Karen's expression change from confident to confused to alarmed in the span of about 10 seconds. She glanced around the room, suddenly aware that the atmosphere was not what she had expected. "I don't understand," Karen said, leaning forward in her chair. "What kind of irregularities?" "Our financial records have been meticulously maintained. Every expense has been properly documented and approved by the board. Margaret nodded slowly. You're absolutely right, Karen. Every expense has been documented. The question we need to address today is whether those expenses were legitimate. That's when I stood up to present our findings. For the next 20 minutes, I walked through every piece of evidence we had gathered. I showed the room copies of business licenses that didn't exist, insurance policies from companies that had no legal status, and bank records that revealed the truth about Karen's shell company network. The room was completely silent as I explained how Karen had systematically stolen over $150,000 from our community over the past 6 months. I detailed how she had used her position on the board to approve fraudulent contracts, inflate maintenance costs, and redirect HOA funds into accounts she controlled. When I finished, every eye in the room was focused on Karen Henderson. She sat frozen for a moment, apparently trying to process how thoroughly her scheme had been exposed. Then, in what I can only describe as a masterclass in deflection and manipulation, she went on the attack. "This is outrageous," Karen said, standing up and addressing the room with what appeared to be righteous indignation. "David Morrison has been targeting me since the day I moved to this community. He's angry because I've been enforcing HOA rules that he's been ignoring for years. This is nothing more than a personal vendetta, and he's apparently willing to fabricate evidence to support his harassment campaign." She turned to the board members. "Margaret, Robert, you know my work. You've seen the improvements I've brought to this community. Are you really going to let one disgruntled resident destroy everything we've accomplished together?" For a moment, I worried that Karen's performance might actually work. She was calm, articulate, and convincing in her denial. If I hadn't seen the evidence myself, I might have believed her. But Margaret was ready with the final piece of our investigation. "Karen," Margaret said quietly, "can you explain why Henderson Consulting Services has been receiving payments from our HOA account for services that aren't listed in any of our approved contracts?" Karen's facade cracked. "I don't know what you're talking about." Margaret pulled out a stack of bank statements. "According to our financial records, Henderson Consulting Services has received $23,000 in payments over the past 3 months for administrative consulting. But there's no record of the board ever approving a consulting agreement with your company. In fact, there's no record of you ever disclosing that you own a consulting business that would benefit from HOA expenditures." The room erupted. Residents who had been sitting quietly suddenly started talking all at once, expressing their anger and demanding answers. Karen looked around desperately, realizing that her carefully constructed operation was collapsing in real time. "You don't understand," Karen said, her voice rising to be heard over the crowd. "I have been protecting this community. I've been ensuring that you get quality services at fair prices. If there were administrative fees, they were necessary to maintain the level of oversight this HOA requires." "Oversight?" shouted Tom Martinez from the back of the room. "You fined me $400 for having grass that was 3/4 of an inch too long. You charged our community $25,000 for insurance from a company that doesn't exist." Other residents began sharing their own experiences with Karen's enforcement tactics. The Johnson family talked about being fined for a mailbox that had been in place for 8 years. The Patels described being threatened with legal action over a flower bed that was perfectly compliant with HOA regulations. Elderly Mr. Chen explained how Karen had made him feel unwelcome in his own neighborhood because of her constant criticism and harassment. As the stories poured out, a clear picture emerged of someone who had used fear and intimidation to maintain control over a community while systematically stealing from the people she was supposed to serve. Karen made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Fine," she said, her voice now cold and threatening. "If you want to pursue this investigation, go ahead. But you should know that I have documentation of violations by every person in this room. I have photographs, measurements, and recordings that prove this entire community has been operating outside of HOA regulations for years. If you try to blame me for enforcing rules that you've all been ignoring, I'll make sure every single one of you faces the full legal consequences of your non-compliance. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't because residents were intimidated. It was because they had finally seen Karen Henderson's true nature. Margaret stood up slowly. "Karen, you're absolutely right about one thing. There will be legal consequences for what's happened in our community. But those consequences won't be for residents who had grass that was slightly too long or mailboxes that were the wrong shade of green." She turned to address the entire room. "I'm calling for an immediate vote to remove Karen Henderson from her advisory position on the HOA board, pending a full audit of all financial transactions conducted during her tenure. I'm also recommending that we turn over all evidence of fraudulent activity to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution." The vote was unanimous. 67 homeowners voted to remove Karen from the board and pursue criminal charges. 0 homeowners voted in her favor. But Karen wasn't done fighting yet. "You're making a huge mistake," she said as she gathered her files and prepared to leave. "I'll be filing lawsuits against every board member for wrongful termination and defamation. I'll be reporting this community to the State Attorney General for harassment and discrimination. And I'll make sure that every violation I've documented over the past 6 months results in the maximum possible fines and legal action." She paused at the door and looked back at the room full of neighbors who had once trusted her. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed." Karen Henderson was wrong about a lot of things, but she was right about one: we had no idea what we had unleashed. What we discovered in the weeks following that dramatic board meeting exceeded our worst fears about the scope of her operation. The criminal investigation, led by Detective Sarah Rodriguez from the County Fraud Unit, revealed that Karen's scheme extended far beyond our little community. She had targeted at least 6 different HOAs across 3 counties over the past 4 years, stealing an estimated $800,000 through her network of shell companies and fraudulent contracts. She was sophisticated, Detective Rodriguez explained when she briefed our board on the investigation's progress. She researched communities before moving in, identified HOAs with weak financial oversight, and positioned herself as an expert who could solve problems that she had actually created. The pattern was always the same. Karen would move into a community, volunteer for HOA responsibilities, identify compliance issues that required expensive solutions, recommend contractors that she secretly controlled, and systematically drain the association's accounts until residents became suspicious or her theft became too obvious to conceal. When that happened, she would simply move to a new community and start over. But Willowbrook Estates was different. For the first time in her criminal career, Karen had encountered residents who were willing to investigate her claims and challenge her authority. Our refusal to be intimidated had not only saved our own community, it had ended her ability to victimize other neighborhoods. The financial recovery took several months, but we were eventually able to reclaim about 80% of the money Karen had stolen. Her house was sold to help pay restitution, her business assets were seized by the state, and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. But the most satisfying resolution came 3 weeks after that dramatic board meeting, and it involved the community pool that Karen had tried so hard to control through her fabricated regulations and compliance requirements. You see, during our investigation, we had discovered that many of Karen's violations and safety concerns about our pool area were completely fictional. The expensive insurance upgrades she had demanded weren't necessary. The health department regulations she had cited didn't actually exist. The liability issues she had raised were manufactured to justify contracts with her fraudulent companies. Once we eliminated Karen's fake requirements and returned to the actual reasonable regulations that had governed our pool for years, we found ourselves with a substantial budget surplus. The money that had been allocated for Karen's fabricated compliance projects was now available for genuine community improvements. Margaret Walsh, who had shown tremendous courage in exposing Karen's operation, proposed that we use those recovered funds to host the largest community celebration in Willowbrook's history. Not just a barbecue this time, but a full weekend festival featuring food trucks, live music, games for kids, and open invitations for friends and family from outside our neighborhood. We called it the Willowbrook Freedom Festival, and we held it on Labor Day weekend at the community pool. The irony was perfect. The pool that Karen had tried to restrict with fake regulations became the centerpiece of our celebration of community spirit and freedom from her tyranny. The space she had attempted to control became a symbol of everything she had tried to destroy. Over 300 people attended that first Freedom Festival. We had residents from our neighborhood, family members from across the city, and even representatives from other communities who had heard about our victory over Karen's fraud scheme. Local news stations covered the event, not just as a community celebration, but as a story about neighbors who had refused to be intimidated by someone who tried to use fear and fake authority to control their lives. The festival became an annual tradition. Every Labor Day weekend, we transformed the pool area into a celebration of community spirit, neighbor helping neighbor, and the simple truth that good people who work together can overcome almost any challenge. And every year, as I look around at families enjoying themselves in the space that Karen Henderson had tried to turn into another source of manufactured violations and fraudulent fees, I'm reminded that the real victory wasn't just stopping a criminal. It was reclaiming our sense of community. Tom Martinez, who had been targeted by Karen for having grass that was 3/4 of an inch too long, became our new HOA president. The Patel family, who had been harassed over their perfectly compliant flower bed, now chairs our community improvement committee. Mr. Chen, who had been made to feel unwelcome because of his holiday decorations, was named our neighborhood's honorary grand marshal.